and I feel like I've learned so much in a very short space of time. It's going to take quite a while to absorb everything. But I also think it is set up perfectly some of the context for what I want to talk about today, and just goes to back up what Matthew said at the beginning of the session, that it really is important for researchers and our clients alike to try and take advantage of some of this type of learning so that we can build on what we're seeing happening in the commercial sense over in China. So I am going to switch gears into talking about a bit more of a commercial perspective, and specifically I'm going to look at how the evolving circumstances in China are actually affecting the modern day consumer. So if I'm being blunt, most corporate interest in China, and a lot of what I and Northstar do in China, is to follow the money. So if that is the case, then the first place to start is really to look at who the luxury consumer, what the luxury segment is doing in China at the moment. The first thing I want to do is just to acknowledge that there is really a changing face of the Chinese luxury consumer at the moment, and it's really important to acknowledge that, because what I've found over the last few years of being there is it represents a much broader mindset of a mainstream consumer. And this shift that we're seeing in luxury is nothing new. That's both in terms of the documentation. There's been a lot of reporting about the change of luxury in China, and the fact that it is in fact following a lot of the trends of what other, not just emerging markets, but Western markets did as well. So for a while now, the luxury growth of the luxury market in China has been slowing down. And that's not to say that the luxury market isn't still growing, it's just that the growth in itself is slowing down. And there's much evidence to support that it is tracking on the same lines as other emerging markets. And this, in a nutshell, is being caused by four key factors. The first thing is the growing ubiquity of luxury goods, which means that actually now demonstrating wealth and status in China is starting to require a different approach. The second is the increasing distaste for extravagant and ostentation displays of wealth, and that really, the practices of the first generation rich and things like that have caused people to think of money as becoming a bit of a dirty word. And there's been this term, I apologise for any of my pronunciation during this, but tu hao, which actually means crass rich. The third sort of factor that we need to consider is that overall the economy is slowing down, and that's obviously in relative terms. But along with that, we see that as the market matures, as with all other markets, consumers are starting to become a little bit more cautious in their spending. And finally, and which I guess is the most specific to the Chinese culture, is that the government is really starting to crack down on gift giving, which is obviously quite a prevalent thing in China, and obviously they're starting to try and stem corruption, which is having an effect on the luxury market, given that that's usually the main gifts that are given. So if we consider that they're the four main factors, what are we seeing manifesting itself on the ground? Well, firstly, and the thing that I've noticed mostly over the last few years, is that customers just aren't as willing to play the game anymore. And they're starting to create this new game where experience rules, experience rules, and it's taking the Chinese consumer into a much more cerebral or experiential place. And when that comes to luxury, what we're seeing is that they're redefining luxury to be something much more about much more about experiencing luxury as opposed to owning a luxury product. And I just want to make clear that that's not me saying that China isn't material anymore. It's a lot of people that are buying and that value the effect of material on their status. And an Ipsos study said that 71% of Chinese consumers still gauge their success on the things that they own. So it very much is still a material culture, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the change is very much on the horizon, and it's something that we're starting to see assert itself, particularly in some of the larger cities like Beijing and Shanghai. And if we're talking about this move from owning to experiencing, the stat that I would use there is that last year annual growth in the luxury experiences grew by 15%. And that in itself, as well as all of the anecdotes and all of the people I've spoken to in China, indicates that there is this change of tide that's happening. Much of the change that's happening within the luxury segment is being attributed to what's being called the sugar generation. They're people that have grown up around wealth and luxury brands, and they're actually, I think they're about 13% at the moment, but they're expected to grow to about 30% of the China affluent population by 2018. So, the sugar generation, you can probably guess why we call the sugar generation. They grew up in the 80s and 90s, they're surrounded by wealth, they were born into a very different socio-economic lifestyle and climate than their parents. They lived a sugar-coated life. And they, being in a position of affluence, were really striving to enjoy life and to have experiences and to really fundamentally use brands to help them express who they are and the things that they like to do. And it's also really important to note that the sugar generation is trying to distance themselves a little bit from the old guard. So they're not just, in fact, they don't want to use the brands that their parents use, and instead they're wanting to find out and give opportunity to maybe some of the niche new brands that are coming in that they can actually take ownership of. Secondly, we've got logo fatigue setting in, and we're seeing the luxury consumer maybe starting to demonstrate a bit more discerning side of their character. Again, I'm not suggesting that's completely the new Chinese reality. You know, logos and this more ubiquitous and socially recognised way of demonstrating wealth is of course still really prevalent, and particularly in the lower tier cities where their stars are on the rise and they're wanting to demonstrate more quickly their rise through the ranks. But you know, in China, it is the case that the more obvious your choice, the stronger your demonstration of status. And of course, status relies on everyone being aware of how much you spend on that handbag or how much you spend on that watch. So the more obvious you can be, the stronger it becomes. But this new sugar generation is tiring of it being quite so predictable and being quite so uniform in the way that they're displaying luxury. So what they're doing is they're starting to look inward at themselves, and that's looking at who they are as people. It's looking at actually just pleasing themselves a little bit more, and it's trying to find a way of differentiating themselves away from what is being quite uniform. So things that we're seeing like quality is becoming actually, I think somebody from LVMH said actually that should be what people are talking about instead of luxury, it should be quality. People are looking towards personalisation, and people are looking towards tailor-made service. So I've mentioned LVMH there, and they're obviously the luxury conglomerate behind Louis Vuitton, and they're really seemingly leading a charge in this area. They, as a group, generate 28% of their revenue in Asia alone. And so the fact that they're starting to make changes makes you feel that actually they kind of know what they're talking about and they're probably reacting to something very real. So I just want to give you two examples. The first example is that in their spring-summer 2013 Paris show, there was none of their LV monogram present anywhere, and it was kind of conspicuously absent given that they're quite well known for that monogram. And the second example is that they've launched Louis Vuitton Maisons in Shanghai, which is a very well curated and invitation-only apartment whereby the connoisseur shopper is invited to come behind closed doors, so there's no pretension, there's no demonstration to anybody else that you're there, to come and have your tailor-made luxury experience. And they're not just having it as a tailor-made service there, they've actually decked the whole place out in a way that is playing into the fact that the new luxury connoisseur wants to have a bit more discovery. You know, they've specially commissioned art, which you can also buy there. So it's playing into this more cultural, intellectual, cerebral space that the luxury consumer is starting to move into. Thirdly, there's a rise in localisation. Customers don't seem as willing just to blindly accept Western brands coming in anymore, as Matthew mentioned at the beginning. They're asking for brands to work a little bit harder for their money. And brands are actually starting to respond quite well in terms of both the product, their branding, and the content that they're putting into China. So for example, you can see some limited edition pieces here that some various luxury brands launched for the Year of the Snake, which was last year. And what this ultimately means for Western brands is where they were able to trade quite happily previously on just being a Western brand, now it's actually only just an insurance for people. It's, they're actually asking a lot more of the brands, but for a Chinese consumer, they've got the insurance that it's coming from one of the big luxury powerhouses from the West. So, what underpins all of this? Well, I want to suggest to you today that it comes from a change in consumers' self-worth. So that what we're seeing is that consumers are starting to reassess who they are. They're reassessing their belief in themselves, a belief that goes beyond just their ability to buy. It goes beyond materialism and the power of money, and instead focuses on who they are as people. It focuses on their personal and individual substance. And walking hand in hand with that is a developing sense of independence and individualism. And therefore, there's also this sense of wanting to be seen as independent and individual, because we've got this sense that Hans talked about earlier, where it's inward and outward, and it's very important that you're not just doing it, but people are seeing that you're doing it too. And I would argue that it's becoming quite a new strand within the notion of face, and which I'll come on to talk about that in a minute. And I just want to say that when I use the word independent, I know that it's very loaded in the context of China, particularly given the political situation in Hong Kong at the moment. So I just want to say when I'm using the word independent, I mean in a much more personal, cerebral, autonomous kind of a way that isn't, I don't mean it in any way politically. So the move to individual and independence isn't at all surprising. As I said, we did it, consumerism took off in the West, it's what happened in other emerging markets like Russia. So it's not particularly surprising that that's the trajectory that it's going on. But it is particularly interesting given the culture that it is trying to operate in. And what I want to talk to you now is that just because the Chinese consumer is now deciding or having to differentiate themselves and to look at luxury in a different way, and they're wanting to become more independent and more individual, it's not that easy for them to assert that in the Chinese culture. And what we're seeing, and what I want to talk to you about, is the different notions of self-worth that play into who they are as people, how they choose to live their lives, and the products and the brands that they choose to buy. So we've got the collective we, which Ken obviously introduced earlier on with the concept of harmony, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. There's the material I, which came obviously with the rise of consumerism, and which arguably isn't so much I, because it actually is affected hugely by the society around them. And then the thing that I want to talk about, which is the emerging sort of sense of independence and individualism. So let's just go through some of those notions of self-worth. So the first one is the collective, which, as I said, Ken talked perfectly about, set up great for me. And it's about, you know, the historical and traditional sense of the word. You know, back in historical and traditional China, notions of selfhood were deeply embedded in larger social relationships. So individualism, which encourages a discrete sense of self, was actually quite weak, and instead self-worth was very closely and intricately weaved into the interests and the needs of the collectives. Whether that's your clan, or village, or family, or extended family, the idea was that you were first and foremost a member of the collective, and then you were yourself. So really the we came before the I. And the philosopher Henry Rosemont wrote, for the early Confucians, there was no me in isolation. And I mean, we've talked about the Confucian culture, and I'm sure everyone's aware of it, but just to quickly recap, you know, that Confucian culture functions by making the individual feel part of a much larger and complex social organism, and that is ruled by clear obligations. So people know their place, they respect above and below, and that's how they function. That's how the harmony Ken was talking about earlier actually manages to exist. People are carrying out prescribed roles, and kind of form of confrontation is discouraged at any point. But if you counter this to the other ancient society, which we've taken a lot of our inheritance from, which is Greece, the difference is quite clear. So in ancient Greece, people had a sense of personal agency, and that was in place of ancient China's sense of harmony. So they had the ability and the will to change their own lives, and they were free to act as they choose. Now that type of ideology breeds individualism, whether it also in China breeds collectivism. Then obviously many years later came the shift towards materialism, which saw quite a lot of, sort of social and economic commentators declaring that China is moving from the we to the I. I would actually argue that that's a very generalised position to take, and the realities are of course much more nuanced. Obviously, firstly, you can't just eradicate 2,500 years of a collective culture just because someone is starting to buy handbags and cars. But secondly, it's important to acknowledge that this move towards the more materialistic I, as they say, isn't quite as I as they perhaps would like to believe. Perhaps it's due to the speed in which affluence and consumerism actually grew, that while materialism was actually supposed to empower the individual, what actually happened was they became slaves to a different type of collective where they were having to demonstrate and be socially recognised for who they are and assert their place in their hierarchy. So materialism really did change the rules of self-worth quite profoundly. And reading a book by Li Zhang, he references an article in there whereby the author really does sort of lament the loss of, again, I apologise for my pronunciation, but Benzen, which is roughly translated as inner or spiritual qualities. So he argues that modern people are quite simply lost in a blind contest over material possession, and their spirituality is submerged by superficial external objects. So, as I said before, we've got to this point where, ironically, these people have become sort of slaves of collectivism when actually they're trying to be more individualistic. And I just want to sort of talk about how this materialism and the idea of materialistic self-worth plays out in business and in the personal realm. In business, perhaps it makes a little bit more sense, and we've obviously established today that China has come from actually a very entrepreneurial and sort of an economically progressive place, and which is a little blip in the middle. So that tongue in my cheek, but and it's coming back with them now. But it is a very entrepreneurial and business focused culture, and I was really surprised when I first started going to China about just how interchangeable the business self is with the personal self. Whereas here people might delineate a lot more, it doesn't really happen in China. So, your personal self dictates who you are in a business environment. And obviously the more successful you become, the richer you become, the better version of yourself you can project, which means the more successful you become, the more rich you become, and so on and so forth, it continues. So it's really, when you think of it that way, it's very clear to understand why many Chinese consumers are plowing a lot of their money into these outward-facing signs of wealth, like a handbag or a car, when actually when you step into their personal environment, it remains quite modest, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But what I'm trying to say about the business manifestation of the materialistic I is that perhaps we can recognise it a bit more, because it is kind of present in Western culture as well. We all use explicit status markers, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy of success, so we can recognise that. But it was materialism's effects on self-worth in the personal realm that sort of created the biggest the biggest backlash, and put this author that I was reading about back up. And Hans, you mentioned the difference between that house was getting married or not, and that's what people are moaning about and saying is one of the worst effects of materialism, is that it is affecting people's love and people's happiness. You might be familiar with the example I'm about to give you, because it was a bit of an internet sensation back in 2010, but nonetheless it perfectly encapsulates what people's issue is with materialism. So you need to imagine, some of you might know it, UK's answer, the UK is take me out show with Paddy McGuinness, not that watch it. But it's called If You Are the One, and up steps a unemployed male suitor and says to the panel of girls, would you like to ride on the back of a bicycle with me, or something like that, I can't remember what it was. And one of the girls, who is actually now quite famous, she was a 22-year-old model from Beijing, she promptly retorted, I would rather cry in the back of a BMW than laugh on the back of a bicycle. And arguably that is a creative whip to enliven the TV show. It was taken viral, and it was taken by many social commentators to represent all that was bad with materialism in China today, and particularly among the youth who simply haven't witnessed another reality. So let's return to the present day and what I'm trying to talk about now, which is the change in self-worth towards a more independent and individualistic notion. And I hope that by showing you these two previous notions of self-worth, it becomes quite clear how powerful they are, and how it makes it hard and quite conflicting for the modern day consumer to decide that they actually want to demonstrate and become more independent and individual. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the shift we're seeing is really fascinating, because it's absolutely happening, but it is really nuanced and full of tension in the way that it's playing out in day-to-day lives. So over the last 6 years, I have had the opportunity to speak and listen to many Chinese consumers discussing everything from advertising to service to luxury goods. But most importantly, I've had the privilege and the opportunity to visit many Chinese customers' homes, and I've observed them and I've listened to them talk about their lives outside of any brand or any product. And no matter what the topic that has come up, which is largely driven by what they want to talk about, the change in mindset and the restrictions and the tensions I'm feeling between these notions of self-worth really has been evident. Now, the fact that we choose to do interviews in consumers' homes isn't just to make it easier, they don't have to come to us, or that we can have a good nose. It's really to see the person behind the social projection. In every culture, ethnographic interviewing is really, really important when you're doing consumer exploration. And it's for this very reason that we can observe things that people either can't articulate in an external environment, or that they don't want to, or that they're not aware of them themselves. And also, it's just as simple as, if you see it for your very own eyes, it tends to make a lot more sense. And out of all the countries that I've done research in, never has been so important or so true than in China, where the notion of face has such a profound effect. To give you the most pertinent and probably obvious example of this is the difference you see between the respondents that turn up to a focus group and then the respondent you see, or the environment that you see when you go and visit their homes. So at the beginning, you see them come in, you're judging them, they want you to judge them on the handbag they've chosen, the coat that they're wearing, the cart they've bought, the watch they're wearing. When you then go to their compounds and you go into their homes, you're faced with quite a different reality. And of course, when I first started going to China, I blamed a lot of it on my Western eyes, I'm just not seeing what the local parameters are. But after the third or fourth or fifth year of going there, you still find that these realities are quite stark. So even without the Western filter on there, it's quite clear that there is this difference between their social projection and then what you actually go and observe, which makes the ethnographic portion of the work that we do so very important. So for example, if I showed you these homes, would you immediately guess that this guy owns an Audi, that he owns a Volvo, and that the person on the end owns a Jag? Probably not. You probably wouldn't think immediately that they're the brands that they own. And it's for the same reason that when you talk to people about their social lives in China, or at least people I've spoken to, they're always going out to eat, they're always going out to karaoke or the restaurants or all those kind of things. They very rarely have their friends or associates in their home. And that's back to the fact that all their efforts and all their money go into carving this outward social projection of who they are, and it isn't or can't be replicated behind closed doors. Being in a consumer's home also allows them to open up way more than they would if they were in a focus group or if they were in any kind of external environment. And we dedicate the first few hours of each interview to learning a bit more about who they are away from any brand or product. And that's really important for us to get a good grounding on their general attitudes, their values, their lifestyles. And it also reveals some of the macro themes that will inevitably then play into some of their purchase decisions. And it's during these conversations over the last few years that I have noticed this desire for independence and forging your own path, but also the conflict that they're feeling in the way that they're choosing to live their lives and the products that they can or should buy. So let's have a look at some of the ways then that the people that I've met are talking about the shift. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge the fact that, and emphasise the fact that the examples I'm going to give you are from middle class consumers in some of the most developed and progressive cities in China. So we're talking Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen. But that in itself shouldn't undermine the message. We've heard today about how fast urbanisation is happening, about how quickly the middle class has grown, and the speed at all that's happened has been unprecedented. So what we're seeing in the tier 1 cities, and we're starting to see ripples of in tier 2 cities, should be taken as a trend that will probably quite quickly develop. And just to give you an example of that, I was recently in Shenzhen talking to both mainstream and luxury customers, while Nikki, my colleague, was in Chengdu talking to exactly the same profile people. And the desire and independence, they would both come back and we start talking to each other and say, I noticed this, and for me it felt much more accelerated and much more obvious in Shenzhen. It's a migrant city, it borders Hong Kong, it's full of opportunity, the average age is just under 30. But Nikki also said, well, I was noticing that in Chengdu. The difference was that in Chengdu, which is known for being much more heavily influenced by state-owned industry, for being much more laid back, it was a little bit harder for maybe us to find, but it was absolutely there. And I think the main difference was in the conflict that the customers were feeling. So while I was definitely seeing the conflict in Shenzhen, Nikki was definitely seeing it more in Chengdu. And it just feels like the generation that's coming of age now in Chengdu seem kind of less willing or less able to make this change and make this step for themselves, but they're absolutely focusing their efforts on having that for their children. So what were people saying? Well, the first thing that people were saying was that they wanted to plug the generation gap. Hans started to talk about this, this focus on romantic love, not being affected so much by your parents and by the extended family. And one of the key things that I keep hearing is that people don't want their parents to look after their children anymore. It has been a very usual process for grandparents to raise the children up into a certain age, either by the grandparents moving into the home or by the children going to live with the grandparents. But this is something that the people I've spoken to are wanting to actively change. And that's for a variety of reasons that we've heard. Some feel that this cross-generational upbringing will actually spoil their children and indulge their children too much and not teach them the value of things. Some feel that because their parents grew up during the revolution, that they won't have the high expectations that the children need to equip themselves with to strive and progress in modern day China. And the other thing is that they just don't want to have the same constraints or the same strict upbringing that they had as children. And so profound was that feeling with one woman I spoke to in Beijing that she had decided, and she told me she became quite emotional, and she said that she decided not to have children because she was scared that she would bring up her child in the same way that she had been brought up herself, which was to feel very controlled, very strict and very unappreciative. So that's obviously quite a dramatic thing to have done, but nevertheless it just goes to emphasise how real this is. But really at the root of this desire to plug the generation gap is an aspiration for their children to be able to develop their own sense of self, their own passions, to nurture the things that they're really interested in, and to give them a much broader horizon on life. And parents are feeling like that they are more able to ensure and help their children along the way if they're the ones that are bringing them up and not their parents. But if we move away from the children and we actually focus on the people themselves, this desire to broaden their horizons and forge a more independent life does manifest itself in different ways. I guess in its most basic form, it's about people choosing their own destiny. I met one lady in Shenzhen this year who was 34. She's married with a 7-year-old son. She left her hometown because she was getting so much pressure from her family to marry and to have a baby, and she decided she wanted to escape. She then went on to say within months she met her husband, married her husband, and had a baby. And so I sat down and thought, well, that's, pulled her up on what to me seemed like quite a big contradiction. But she replied, well, but this time it was my choice, which plays into what Hans was saying earlier. And an interesting offshoot of them wanting to be makers of their own destiny is the evolving relationship we're seeing between the genders. And I'm sure it's not a coincidence that of all of the premium sort of profile people and they're urbanites, but the women that I've been interviewing, there's this real palpable sense that they're striving to create their own identity, very much away from their husbands. They're developing their own careers, they're starting their own businesses, and also it's about developing their own identity within the personal realm as well, by having their own social circles and doing their own things away from their husband. So overall, they just want to have their own life. So another lady I met, a 41-year-old in Shenzhen, she said, I don't want to rely on a man as this means I have no status. I don't want to have to ask anyone for money because I just don't want to have to justify myself. And actually so strong has this theme been that it's been when I've met women with a more traditional mindset that they felt to be the exception as opposed to this being the exception. So still related to the idea and the theme that we're seeing of wanting to create your own destiny is the wish to be recognised and to progress on your own merit and on your own application, as opposed to Guanxi, which again, apologies for the pronunciation. I'm not going to sit here and even try and explain Guanxi. to anybody, but it's a very complex and very culturally embedded phenomenon in China, and it basically refers to the benefits gained from social connections, and these can be really far-reaching, they can last a lifetime, and they can be really, really powerful. And I guess for our Western brains, it's probably a much more profound version of it's not who you know, sorry, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And the fact that people are starting to sort of rebel against the power of Guanxi and wanting to be actually recognised for their own merit and be respected for who they are and what they can bring to the table, again shows that this developing sense of self-worth that doesn't rely on money, it doesn't rely on the collective, it relies on who they are as people and the way that they choose to present themselves. So, coming back to the idea of broadening horizons, another theme that comes through really strongly is the idea of international travel, but not just travelling, demonstrating that you travel and demonstrating that you've got a very international and global outlook on life. For example, last year when I was in Beijing, I met, in fact everyone that I met had quite a strong connection outside of China. You know, whether they studied abroad, they might have lived abroad, or they just make sure that they take holidays outside of China so they can get you know, more broad global experience. But more than this, their homes have become canvases to demonstrate their international travel, whether it's fridge magnets, rough guides, you know, memorabilia from the different places they've been to. It feels like, you know, that fridge has got is completely covered in magnets, but they're wanting to show people that they have got this more international outlook, which ultimately makes them feel like they're more progressive. And it's also when, you know, when I was in Shenzhen, I thought, oh, you know, I'm seeing the same thing again, but then you actually realise, well, they're not travelling. I mean, many people weren't travelling, but I was lulled into this belief from being at home and from listening to them talk that they had travelled. So it was just as much demonstrating that they want to and they've got this sort of affinity with the international, you know, they're a global citizen, as much as actually travelling and experiencing for themselves. So that, as I mentioned at the beginning, has become part of the sort of the progressive urbanite notion of face, and we've come full circle to where we started at the beginning, where doing and being says much more than having. So there's some of the topics that people are talking about sort of in terms of their lifestyle and values, but just want to for the last 5 minutes apply to what that means in the material world. So taking the automotive segment, which is a good place to start for a few reasons. The first being that obviously the car market has grown exponentially over the last few years. It's the biggest material purchase after a home. It's one of the biggest status symbols that you can have, and it just happens to be a topic that I've talked to a lot of consumers about over the years. So it's also, though, a really perfect example of where we're seeing these three different notions of self-worth come together and conflict and confuse and make it really hard for the modern day Chinese consumer. So part of my job is understanding the purchase process and the key drivers for why people buy a car. And you know, when we're doing the research in developed markets and Western markets, it seems to be quite a similar pattern that we see. It's a lengthy process, there's lots of research, people look online, they go to the dealerships, they test drive, they go back home, they look online again, they go back to the dealerships, so on and so forth. But it also ultimately results in what is quite a personal and independent choice. And that just isn't the case in China. And in fact, when I first started going to China, I found it really frustrating to try and get to the bottom of why people have actually bought what they've bought. It just seemed like their reasoning was just completely full of contradiction. And my Western brain found it really hard to actually understand what on earth was going on. In hindsight, you know, now having been there a bit more and understanding what's going on, I can see that it's because this purchase process of a car throws up the need for the buyer to consider all versions of themselves, the collective, the material, and then this emerging sense of individualism. So the purchase process for the average Chinese consumer, and luxury consumer that is multifaceted, and it actually works on a process of elimination versus sort of targeted consideration. So it's a case that they'll probably whittle down their choices as opposed to sort of go gung-ho for the one car that they want. And it's also really important to remember during the purchase process that as a market, you know, the automotive market is relatively new there, so their experience and their knowledge with cars is relatively low. And we often talk about the customers that we speak to as having a catalogue knowledge of cars. And what we mean by that is that they can easily reel off the features and the specification that a car has got, like they've studied the catalogue. But when you ask them and you go a little bit deeper, well, what's the benefit to you of owning that, having that particular feature? Why was it so important to you to make sure you had that feature? They kind of stumble and they're not really able to give you much more of an explanation. It also means that word of mouth recommendations carry a lot more weight for the Chinese consumer. And that brand becomes a really powerful shorthand, whether it's good or not. So, you know, you often hear, you know, well, why do you want that feature on your car? Well, because Mercedes do it, so it must be good. You know, they don't understand it, it's just the brand over there carries so much that they blindly will follow what the brand says that they should do. So where does their purchase journey begin? So more often than not, it begins with I was going to say desire, but it's more of a need to buy import over domestic or local build. So the preference for import is mostly to do with status, therefore it's to do with the material notion of self-worth. So this is the first point when we see, okay, here's materialism coming into play. And the power of import is so powerful in China that when you look at a car that's made locally through joint venture, the fact that that car has got those Chinese characters on the back, people are willing to spend a hell of a lot more money to make sure that they don't have those Chinese characters. That is how important an import purchase is in China. The next determiner is brand. So at this point we see the collective notion of self-worth having a really profound effect over the material or over the individual. So yes, the desire to buy premium is driven by status. It's the BBA, Benz, BMW and Audi are considered the default premium choice over there, more socially recognised. But when it comes to which premium brand to buy, that then becomes full of collective intricacy. Firstly, each of these brands, BMW, Audi and Mercedes, have got a really strong place and symbolic meaning in society in China. Audi is a government's car, it feels commonplace, it's very much sort of pigeonholed to a particular part of society. You've got BMW, which feels like new, which is for the new money, and then you've got Mercedes-Benz, which is for the old money, and which is largely associated with being chauffeur-driven. And that in itself is a really important point. I've spoken to many young Chinese consumers who have said point blank, I'm not going to buy a Mercedes because I don't want to be confused for a chauffeur. And by being confused for a chauffeur, it's immediately undermined their key reason for buying a premium brand, which is to show the status symbol. And I guess I just want to emphasise that it's not just maybe like it is here, where it's an unappealing brand association. People don't really want to buy the brand because it feels old or it feels too flashy. In China, and it's hard to explain, but it's so much more profound and powerful than that. It feels like it's not just that you don't want to, but you can't buy a car like that. Okay. The other big effect of collective self-worth during the automotive purchase process is bound up in the notion of face. So people won't buy under or over their station when it comes to cars. You hear things like, my boss has got an Audi A6, so I can't buy one, or I don't want something I'm flashy, I'll be the only person in my compound with that car. Or on the other side of the coin, my husband, my friend, my colleague has got a BMW, so I can't buy any lower than them. Factor all that into as well to the fact that you always have to buy bigger and better the next time round, you can't be seen to downsize. It becomes quite a huge influence on people's decisions, this collective notion. This was someone that I met in Shenzhen this time, and he was talking to me about the fact that he'd settled for buying his Volvo. and he really wanted to buy an Audi, but he talked to his family, and his family told him no, it was inappropriate for him to buy an Audi, so he whittled down the choices. He couldn't buy a BMW, I forget why, because his boss had one. He couldn't buy an Audi because it was felt for government officials, so he's left between Lexus and Volvo. He wasn't going to buy a Lexus for all of the Japanese reasons, and so he was left with Volvo. And he really didn't love his car at all. He'd spent a lot of money on his car, but here you can see a prime example of where that need to satisfy their collective notion of self-worth has completely overridden what his personal desires were, and his hard-earned cash at the end of the day. There's many other conflicting and contradicting rationales, and I don't have time, probably don't even myself understand what all of them are, but I just want to move on to where we're seeing two examples of this independent notion of self-worth coming into play with the automotive purchase. So the first breakaway we can see is the introduction of the SUV, and then following on from that, the hatchback. So the SUV was once seen as a very wild, off-road vehicle. It had no place in the city, it had no place in business. And that was very much due to the fact that it's in a culture which is a scene of business sedans. So to have an SUV would really stand out. But now when you go to China, SUVs are actually highly aspirational. They're seen as more relevant for the city, and people are even starting, some of the younger generations are starting to feel that they're appropriate for business to a certain degree. And the interesting thing about SUVs is it plays directly into what I was saying at the beginning, in that their whole, raison d'etre is to say, I do rather than I buy. I have an interesting life because I own an SUV versus I'm a slave to my business. Another way that we're seeing this sort of wave of independence manifest itself is with an increasing focus on the interior. Now, the interior, if you consider, only your friends and your associates get into your car, so there's no way that your interior can signify any status to the people outside in the wider society, but people are starting to actually put more focus on there, and they're starting to look for clever solutions and things like that. And one of the Volvo owners that I spoke to loved all of the clever gadgets and features that you have in his car. And when I asked him more about it, he said, well, I love it when my friends or my business associates come in and they notice something really clever, and it makes me feel really good because it makes me think that they think I'm clever too. So here we see that new dimension of face coming in, where it's about actually sort of being the desire to be seen as intelligent and more substantial than just someone who throws money at something. Now, and I hope that I've helped you to understand a little bit about the modern Chinese consumer and the tensions they face in the new modern world. One thing we haven't talked about is obviously how Western brands should respond to this, and that would be a completely whole other talk. But what's clear is that brands do need to try and find a way to help consumers balance all versions of themselves and to make it a little bit easier for them as it inevitably becomes even harder. They need to create and communicate products that respect the collective, that don't undermine that need for the material eye, but also finding ways to celebrate them as independent and individual. Thank you.